Welcome to the Helm Dev Community Call for July 12th, 2018. So we normally run this off by going through announcements, then we have a stand-up of core members and then other folks, and then we get into discussion topics for the week. We don't have any listed announcements. Does anybody have any announcements that we should share? Silence, I'm guessing, means nothing, so no announcements. Fantastic. So why don't we start with stand-up? And I guess for that, I'll say, Taylor, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So I'm finally getting back into doing Helm stuff. I've had a bit of a hiatus as we were finishing up stuff in my day job. So I will be doing probably just first digging through my own notifications queue, and then I'll be digging through the PR queue and start trying to review PRs this week and next week. So that's my primary focus. Once I do that and kind of whittle that down, I'll probably be taking on some of the Helm 3 tasks around building some of that. So that's my current plan. So you'll see me again. I haven't disappeared. I'll pass it off to Adnan.
Okay, not much specific on Helm, I guess. I have been having some discussions around charts and in particular the distributed search proposal and what we want to do to make it easier to for people to stand up their own chart repositories. And so there's some ideas been thrown around that we had in the charts chat call. If you're interested, it's recorded, so go and check that out. But one of the ideas is to have to maybe build out a service which allows you to connect to GitHub repo and then have all those charts automatically built and packaged. So I'm gonna be talking with Scott Rigby, one of the other chart maintainers, and we're gonna kick off that project soon. Other than that, there's some work going on in Cube Apps to move from the Helm CRD thing that we were using to a Tiller proxy service. And that should actually be released pretty soon. So I hope to come and demo that at some point and explain how that stuff works and why we're doing that. Could be pretty interesting, I think. I'll pass it on to Nick.
Hey guys, so last week didn't really have much going on with Helm. Did a couple of GitHub issues, responded to it when I got some notifications, and took a look at a couple of PRs, but not much else. Hopefully I'll have more time for Helm stuff this week. So that is me. I will pass it on to Michelle.
Sure. 1 second, let me leave my phone. Okay, great. This past week, I copied Adam on what he's doing in terms of like the changes for 1.11, support 1.11, and kind of got to feel his pain. And then we also talked about Helm 3 and what's going on there. And so I've been working on the proposal for like what Helm test should look like in Helm v3, and I started by going through all the Helm test issues in the issue queue, opened and closed, just to get an idea of what people have been requesting and like what their use cases are. So mainly R&D this week, and then I came across issues as I was in the issue queue, so I just ended up answering questions and reviewing a few PRs. So this upcoming week, I'm focusing on kind of getting that proposal together so that I can share it with everybody else, and just going through the issue queue a little bit more. Brian, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, this past week I was Helm related. I fixed in the, I think the 1.10 release candidate, a panic on Helm list, and then I was looking into this a TLS support question, and I had to make sure it wasn't because it came on the security mailing list. I had to make sure it wasn't an actual vulnerability, but then it's just it turned out to be a documentation issue. So I have to open up a PR and update the documentation to reflect how to add IP sans to the tiller certificate so that it passes hostname verification and doesn't fail. Other than that, that's basically what I've been doing on Helm this week. Who else can I hop
I
between?
think that's me next.
Okay.
So what I've been working on is two things I've started to get into. One is notifications. There are a lot of old versions of Helm in use, and we never tell people when there's new versions out. And so to look at how we can notify people, you can look at Minikube, and what Minikube does is probably being a very simple way of doing it. And so looking for a path to do that. The other one is after learning about how Kubeapps is doing their verification work with the proxy, basically you can verify a user has permission to CRUD an object within a namespace before going off and telling Tiller to do it. That really interests me, especially looking at the multi-tiller workflows that a lot of folks use, having different tillers and different namespace because it's the only way to control permissions. Maybe there's a way to couple that back to users by baking some of this stuff from Kubeapps directly into tiller. I'm kind of looking in to see whether it would be possible as an optional flag to add on. I don't really know yet, but I'm exploring the idea, and Adnan and I have been talking about it. Because for at least for my use, it could cut down on some of the ways we use multiple tillers and multiple namespaces and managing that complexity. So exploring that right now. And that's kind of what I've been up to in the past week, in addition to all the emails going out to the maintainers on maintainery things as we work with governance stuff. And so that's me. The next thing, we tend to open this up to folks who are not Helm core developers, but in the community. Does anybody else have anything they want to talk about before we move on to the discussion? All right, going once, twice, three times. Okay, nobody had anything else. Then the next discussion, there are two things on the discussion. I added both of them. One of them is moving the docs to their own repo and looking at how we can handle the documentation. And then the other was actually getting into the recommended Kubernetes labels, which just came out. Did anybody have anything else they wanted to discuss this week? Awesome. All right.
Wait.
So,
I think I missed the first 10 minutes. Did we already talk about governance a bit?
no, we have not talked about governance.
Okay.
No, we haven't. Is there something specific around the governance you
No,
wanted to talk about?
I just I was curious in terms of Chart Museum specifically, like how I guess how decisions are made, and because basically right now I'm pushing things to master and merging my own PRs. Do things change in that regard to better serve Helm? And
All right. So, well, yeah, Nikhil, thanks for adding that. Well, let's jump on this real quickly. To give a little context, on the maintainers list, a draft long-term governance has come out. For anybody who doesn't know, there is a provisional governance for the Helm project in place as a whole. That provisional governance actually sets a date and time by which we will have a long-term governance in there, and a draft for that just came out. In that draft, that would fall under code-based maintainers, because we have this idea of project maintainers which oversee the whole thing, and then code-based maintainers. And code-based maintainers are essentially given the ability to choose their own paths for making their decisions. It doesn't specify anything for those kinds of things.
Okay.
So if you're using a current workflow and it works for you, it's up to the code-based maintainers for that particular code base, or like in the case of charts, where charts maintainers kind of own a set of code bases, to decide how to do that.
okay, and if there's a single code base maintainer for that project, then that's how it goes.
That's how it goes.
Okay.
There are some things that may come in. So the CNCF projects are all expected to follow. Oh, let me see if I can find it. Give me just a second. So there is this set of CI automation standards that all projects are expected to follow. And I'm going to try and pull up an example real quick. We haven't touched on this in Helm yet, but I'm sure it'll be coming soon. It's called CII Best Practices. It's called Core Infrastructure. There it is. The Core Infrastructure Best Practices. And I'll drop in the site into chat here for it. We haven't talked much about it, but we're going to be expected to adopt and use this as part of being in the CNCF and then get a badge and all of that for it. I think most of our code bases follow all the requirements now. The CNCF, which is part of the Linux Foundation, tries to have their stuff under here. So that's why you'll see things like Node.js if you go look at the list. And then they're given things like, best practices. Are they gold? Are they just passing? Things like that. Are they in progress? And they're going to want us to get to a certain state for this in the near future. Most of our stuff, I don't see it being a problem, but it's something we'll be attacking on that. And that may have impact on some of the development practices, but I haven't dug into it yet, so I don't know.
Okay. Didn't mean to detract.
No. This is a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a look at this CII thing.
All right. So that's that one. The next one that I had was moving the docs to their own repo. So right now, our docs live alongside Helm itself. But if we're going to go, so there's some things like I've got a personal thing. Well, for Samsung, most of the people who work in Samsung are in Korea. So Korean's kind of an interesting language to us. Kubernetes is heading down the multilingual route, and actually Korean is one of the languages it's heading down. And it would be nice to be able to add some things to our docs like translations, maybe have search in there, and some other things. And so the question is it worth moving our docs into their own repo? Since it generates its own site, that's where we link off to. This will get into the whole version 2 versus version 3 of Helm thing eventually too. I don't know what that would be, but right now the docs just kind of live alongside the Helm project, and then we've got some scripts that turn those docs into a site. They actually do some really neat things on there, such as parsing the outputs and changing anchor names and things like that. It's kind of a little bit of hackery in JavaScript to make it work. And is it time we switch to like a documentation tool with a documentation repo and things like that? I was talking about this with Reinhard, and he actually suggested another tool, and I'm forgetting the name of it now, but it's a tool that does ASCII doc instead of Markdown, because he would prefer to use ASCII doc instead of Markdown. But that brought up the whole thing, and there's an open issue on this, Helm issue 4100. So what do folks think? I've just babbled a bunch.
I like the idea. I think it'd be really good to do, and I'm all for getting something that would more easily enable the whole internationalization stuff, so we can have proper translations and things in there. So I'm for that idea.
Matt, what was the example that you had that was of a project using Gitbook again?
Kubi Builder.
That's right. Yeah, I think that was a very good example.
Here, I'll go ahead.
What it could look like.
I'll grab the URL for you. So they put their documentation into a Git book recently. And here is the site for it if you want to go take a look. You'll see search in the top left. And then you can see their structure. One of the neat things is there's a 2-column thing. So if you go look at a page like this link I'm dropping in here, why don't I just share my screen? Maybe that'll make it easier. Because I can do that. So here's what it looks like. One of the things you'll notice is by default, I'm here on the simple controller example. And so you'll see things like code in line with a reference next to documentation. There's information blocks. There's things like this. Some of the stuff like the information blocks, these are native to ASCII doc, but they are not native to Markdown. And so they do throw some of this capability in there. But there's some neat things here where I can now do a side-by-side. And so where you've got documentation about a code snippet next to that code snippet. Gitbook does produce a website, but it can also produce things like EPUBs and PDFs and other formats as well. This is the one that came to mind for me, just because it's been very actively developed. It has built-in internationalization into Gitbook. Basically, you have a top level. You basically have sub books where each language is a different book, and then you can throw something on your theme that can even try to auto select. By default, they ask you to opt in yourself on the front page of the docs, but you can try to auto select based on your browser as well, with a little bit extra. But this is kind of how the flow of it works. I'm drawing a blank on what the other project was that Reinhard suggested.
I'll just chime in here. I really love the idea of moving the docs into its own repo, especially for the internationalization bit. And then we did that for the Kubernetes repo. Like we moved the design proposals and the developer guide into the community repo a while back, and that like helps make things cleaner. So definitely there's some precedent there too. What would we do for Helm 2 versus Helm 3 docs? Would they both live in the same repo under different directories? We don't have to have an answer for that, but just a question.
That's a great consideration though. Yeah, I don't know.
I would expect we're going to have Helm 2 support, like formal support, for probably 6 months, and we'll probably want to leave the documents up afterwards too, the documentation up. So we'll want it to be easily accessible. Part of me almost wants to have like a docs.helm.sh/v2 that just has version 2 and maybe v3, and that's where they're deployed to. Where the code lives may be entirely different from that.
Yeah.
But
if you go to the Docker Compose docs, they do a pretty great job of splitting out like the 3 different syntax.
Oh, what do they do? Do they
It just, I mean, on the
like
left,
inline?
it's pretty easy to find. Like, are you
Oh,
looking
I know
for
what
the
you're talking
Docker
about.
2 Compose reference? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not super good, but
Cool.
an example.
by the way, the project, I found the project Reinhard had suggested that was ASCII doc. Here's the link for it. They have not figured out internationalization yet, but their documents are in a book. It'll look fairly similar. The big difference between these ends up becoming Markdown versus ASCII doc. And I'm one of those people who does not have a preference either way. Markdown is more popular, but ASCII doc is, what's a good word? Is
Might be
maybe
easier
more
to
technical.
move.
Yeah.
Might be easier to move to current documentation, given that's already in Markdown.
It would be a lot easier to move it. If you look here, I'll drop in the ASCII doc quick reference, and you can see the difference. Markdown is essentially a subset of ASCII doc. I mean, the styling is different. So there are tools that can automatically just switch between the two, like Pandoc can do that kind of thing.
Okay.
So you can, I just dropped in a cheat sheet that kind of walks through it. So we don't need to decide on this right now, but if it sounds good, I might kick off the process sometime after I've done the notifications work to migrate everything, so we can think more about it. All right. Lost the meeting minutes again. Then
Is
the
there an
other
open issue for that, Matt?
Yes, it's linked in there, issue 4100.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you.
Then the other thing that came up was Helm. Yeah, there's another issue. Kubernetes switched to a set of recommended, it was originally labels and annotations, now it's just labels. It's finally landed in the Kubernetes documentation. The pull request is linked there. Let's see whether I can find it in the docs themselves. But basically, it's very similar to the current ones listed in our documentation, but they have entirely different names, and it's prefixed. And so how did we want to handle that? I'm biased because I was part of I did the pull request, but the pull request was based on the app definition working group. The goal here was interoperability. And because we want more than one tool to be able to interact with the labels and this information. The whole background for it is on the pull request And here is the actual documentations, the documentation on it with examples. And you'll see things that you can definitely relate back to things we already have in Helm. It's just a different name structure. And I'm not sure the best way to handle this. When do we bring it into Helm? What do we do with charts that already exist? You know, what does this mean for API compatibility, things like that with charts? Thoughts?
I haven't looked at this in depth yet, but were you thinking along the lines of maybe like adding these to the template when you generate a chart using Helm Create? Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. So Helm already has a set of labels and annotations best practices here. We
Yeah.
have our standard labels.
Yeah.
And how do we, you know, what do we do with our standard labels compared to those? And I haven't opened an issue yet, but.
Yeah, I'd probably look a little bit further and see what the diff is.
The diff is almost one-to-one, just different names.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And it wouldn't be unheard of to say that what Helm did inspired part of the conversation, as well as what folks already do in other systems. But there was Helm, there's what folks did over an OpenShift and their stuff. There was material from several different places, and it was kind of all brought together into one things with logical names and stuff like heritage and chart and release. They have to, like a release is, I think, the instance name, things like that. Component is directly maps to component, but it's namespaced with app.kubernetes.io. The namespacing is because in Kubernetes label land, anything that's not private to the user is supposed to be namespaced. So
I think anything that's one-to-one with labels that we already have, we could deprecate but still support our own labels and say this is the new label for this thing moving forward. And then there are some things that are always going to be Helm specific, like release and heritage. And they could just remain as they are, or perhaps be namespaced in a Kubernetes compliant way.
Well, what is Heritage's default value? Isn't that Tiller or a Helm or Draft or something like that? If I remember right.
I think it's Heritage Tiller, and I think that's the only value it's ever been.
I think if you're using Draft, the Heritage is set to Draft, if I remember right. Michelle, do you remember? Yeah.
I don't know that we do that anymore.
Okay, because
Yeah.
that would be the tool called the label called Managed By. It's meant to be whatever that thing is. So even there's a direct one-to-one correlation.
There you go.
Like adding annotations to me like makes sense if that's easy. That's not really going to cause problems, but I just don't know what the implications of changing labels are. Like that could mess with your deployment objects. I just don't want to mess up people's deployments.
Now that y'all know about it, I'll file an issue and we can come back to it.
I think if we're talking about charts in the Kubernetes charts repo, most of them use the app label for a selector, which I don't, as far as I know, is not part of, I guess it's kind of like instance. I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll try and do the mapping in the issue and I'll write the issue up later today.
Yeah, that'd be good.
But because of time check here, we should probably figure out assignments for next week. Do we have anybody up for issue Sherpa notes or meeting moderator?
I can do issue Sherpa unless somebody else is really passionate.
No. Notes for next week?
I can take notes.
And moderator. Anybody want to moderate?
I can do meeting moderator.
All right. Fantastic, everyone. Thank you for a wonderful meeting. We're ending on time here. I'll let everyone get to their next meeting. And I guess we'll see you all on the interwebs. That'll
Bye.
stop recording.
See ya.
Thanks. Bye.